Hello and welcome. I can't believe it's been 16 years of Minnebar. Every time I participate in a Mini-Star event, I'm excited for the presentations and the learning from all these smart people. But what I look forward to most are the connections that I make between sessions. And from the very beginning, we've made those connections. We've tried to bring people together from disparate tech and design groups. We've wanted designers to talk to developers and have that cross-pollination spur on all sorts of amazing things. These amazing things can happen when we connect smart, passionate people. And we made a lot of those connections at the very first event. Many of the sponsors we had then are still sponsors today. Many of those first participants have been in the community and been community supporters for years now. Well, those connections made it that first event grew. The next year, we had 3 times the participants, more conversations, more connections, even stronger community. Many of you have been to Mini-Star events before, so you know what I'm talking about. Many of you have met someone at one of these events that helped you in your career, maybe became a colleague later, or you formed a friendship with. Some of you may have even created products or businesses with these connections that you made. How many conversations and connections have come out of this amazing community? Well, I'm one of those people who made a connection at one of these events, many connections actually. I'm actually all of those people. It was connections I made at the very first Minnebar event that gave me the confidence to start a technology consulting company with 2 good friends. And it was from among the connections made inside this community that our first clients emerged. Then it was at Mini Demo in 2009 where I made another connection who later became a colleague and then a friend and then a co-founder. And it was because of this connection we were able to create several companies here in Minneapolis where hundreds of technologists still work today. These are places like Reach Local, Gannett, USA Today, Samsung SmartThings, Bright AI, One Tap Away, to name just a few. So yeah, it was just a chance meeting in a sweaty, loud, kind of nerdy event at Intermedia Arts in Minneapolis that made all this possible for me and has made a real impact on the Minnesota tech community. Well, it was another such conversation that actually ignited the spark that is now this unconference, one that ultimately led to the formation of the Mini-Star organization and all the events that they put on. That was a conversation I had back in 2006 with Chris Messina. It was at an O'Reilly Emerging Tech Conference in San Diego. It was in between sessions, and somehow I'd gotten word that Chris and others were going to talk about this new kind of conference in the hallway or lobby. I think it might have been a whiteboard where I first saw the note that says, "Hey, come talk to us in the hall." So you never know when that next conversation will lead you. After that conversation, I returned home, determined to bring Minnesota its own BarCamp. Well, earlier this week, I was able to reconnect with Chris and have another conversation 16 years after that first connection. Chris is in the process of moving today. Otherwise, he would have loved to say hello in real time. So a video conversation will have to do. But first, introduce Chris a little bit. He's spent more than a decade working on social technologies. He designs products and experiences, works with startups, and has changed the world by giving away many of his creations. He co-founded the first BarCamp, opened the first co-working space, and invented the idea of using the hashtag in social media in the way that is now ubiquitous. So here's that conversation now. Let's get into it. Let's get into the origin story of BarCamp for those who haven't heard of it. And frankly, I would have thought everyone would have heard of it at Minibar by now, but we have continually more and more new people that come who say it's like their first event of our series. And so it's amazing that we're continuing to bring in new people to the community. So, yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. I'm just like, it's so, I guess, humbling and just exciting, to hear that you guys are still carrying forth the BarCamp torch. It's it's I've even lost track of how many other BarCamps are currently going on. I mean, in some ways that's, if you think about kind of a lot of the conversations that are happening now about Web3 and decentralization and DAOs and all that trendy stuff, right? There's sort of like ways to do it where it kind of like happens to you as kind of a necessity, which is half economic and just half values based and half, I don't know, of the moment. And then there's kind of like now when you're doing it in response or reaction to a bunch of stuff that's happened in terms of centralization and advertising. And I know I'm like getting super deep into it, but I guess like the reason why I'm bringing it up and why I think it's a great place to start, is to sort of think back to 2005 when BarCamp got its start and what it was in that moment actually in opposition to. And so the first BarCamp was planned in August 2005. It happened in Palo Alto, California. This was before Twitter existed. This is before the iPhone existed. This is before so many of the technologies that, of course, we take for granted now were available to us. And a lot of the organization of BarCamp happened in a rather decentralized kind of way. Not only did we use, the Notion kind of product of the day was something, essentially it was wikis. And we self-hosted our own
Wiki,
wikis.
right?
PBWiki was eventually the one that we migrated to, but we were using, I don't know if it was like TiddlyWiki, it doesn't matter. But, it was a world writable web page. I mean, you can't even imagine it. Like for anybody who's actually visited the PBWorks BarCamp wiki, I've had to shut it down more or less because of all the spam. And, it's really sad actually that a resource like that can't sort of persist on the open web anymore because there are so many attackers. But back then in 2005, it was a small enough ecosystem that you could have a world writable web page that anybody could write on. And it didn't necessarily attract, grifters or horrible people or whatever. So you had a tool like that. So anybody could come and like take notes and write things down. And then the way in which I actually found the venue was using this app at the time called Plazes, Plazes. And it was a little kind of status bar app for the Mac that showed you where your friends were. It was sort of like a buddy list for your friends' locations. And a friend of mine, Ross Mayfield, who now leads platform at Zoom, of all places, actually was getting his office started he was actually building a wiki software company at the time, an enterprise wiki software company, which of course at the time I thought was ridiculous. Like what enterprise is going to use, a wiki? And of course now Notion is huge and you've got all these like corporates that are using the software that we were using back then. And I saw that he was like down the street from where I was working. And at the time I was working on a social browser. And, this was 6 days out to the actual BarCamp event. This was, I believe, I want to say it was the end of July or something. And, we were trying to put together the event on August 7th, because as I was saying, our event was in opposition to an event that was being organized by Tim O'Reilly. Tim O'Reilly is a big open source publisher. I learned a lot from him. He's the guy that came up with the word web, or coined the phrase Web 2.0. He was running an event called FooCamp, which is short for Friends of O'Reilly, in Sebastopol, California. And at the time, there were some well-known people in the tech industry. One of them notably was Robert Scoble, who had previously been invited to FooCamp, but hadn't been invited back. Now, I didn't know anybody back then. I didn't have a network. It was me and Matt Mullenweg and, Tontik Chelik and a bunch of other folks, and I had just kind of come to the Bay Area in 2004. So I was excited to like host our own kind of open source, free spirited event. And if Tim O'Reilly was so big on open source, then why couldn't we do the same thing for his event? So that's where BarCamp kind of came from. Essentially, we were uninvited or not invited to his event. All the cool people were going up to his event, Larry and Sergey from Google and all the rest. And we're like, what's the big deal? Like, it's open source. We'll just fork it. We'll make our own event. Now, I was adamant that the event had to happen at the same day as FooCamp. Now, a lot of people who went to FooCamp wanted to come to BarCamp. And I was like, no, you have to choose. You're either with us or you're with them. And that meant that we had to organize the entire event in 6 days. Well, I didn't really know how to organize events. We didn't have a venue. We didn't have food. We didn't have sponsors. We didn't have anything. And so we came together in IRC using a wiki, using SMS and text messaging, brought this thing together, spur of the moment, no money. And originally I was going to plan this event to be in the Sierras. This is going to be a real camping event. I was like, we're going to put the camp in BarCamp. That was a dumb idea. Anyways, it turned out that Ross Mayfield had this office. He hadn't opened up his business yet. It was empty. So brought us in and said, here, you can use this. It was a great space. And, within 6 days, we organized the whole thing. We brought together computers and whiteboards and, got the word out. And what I thought was going to be a group of, 20 of my friends or new friends coming together to talk about web stuff and social internet turned out to be, 300 people. And so this was sort of like just a moment where so many of us who had connected through the internet and through web technology realized that, one, these are real people, that we've been talking to. They're not just avatars and fake names. And back then I was Factory Joe. I hadn't yet sort of taken on my full IRL persona. And, we love talking about this stuff. So we organized the event as a quote unquote unconference, which came from Food Camp. And the idea was that all the participants who appeared and showed up were just that. They were participants. They weren't attendees. They were people who were engaged in the co-creation of an experience and an event and content for everybody to enjoy and to learn from. And if there was a topic that you were interested in, you got a chance to put it up on the wall. And if other people were interested, they'd show up. And if it were 2 or 3 people having a conversation, that was totally fine. If it was 50 people and, you were talking about, some new web standard or some new marketing thing or, hacking WordPress, cool. You could have a big room and suit yourself. And it worked. I mean, it was amazing. It really was kind of like, we also got from Sarah Wing, the law of 2 feet, which meant that, if you were bored and there was a conversation going on, get the hell out, go to someplace else. Like there's no obligation for you to stay there. There's no social norm that says stick around in a conversation that you find boring or that is unengaging. You're the determinant of your own experience.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's kind of how it came together.
Well, I think some of the frantic origin energy that you had with that was sort of shed onto me in 2006 after we spoke, because I came back and we put our first Minnebar together in a month, and I thought that was really rapid. But yeah, a week would have been something. But I just went back and looked at the PB Wiki site for those first 2 Minnebar events. They're still there. They're such a great resource. I'm like looking back at all the sessions and the participants. Everything was planned on that one wiki page, which is amazing. Now we have an organization, we have Slack, we have all these things that are happening. Yeah, it was just great. And I mean, to be honest, most of the spirit of the original BarCamp is still, here at Minnebar, which is going to be super exciting. There's a few things because of the size of the event we've had to do to make some.
How many people are coming now?
Well, 1,600 or 1,500 and change came last year. This year we've capped it at 1,000 for COVID reasons and things. But still, I mean, we got the whiteboards, but we do some presentation submittals and things like that. Anyone can submit, but we had to do something to make it a little less chaotic.
I mean, these things are hard to scale, Yeah. So I get it.
I mean, it's fun to do it at all sizes. So we make sure to have small events throughout the year as well to kind of keep that spirit.
That's great. And I mean, to be clear, like what we were trying to do was again, we didn't know anything about running conferences. We didn't do it to make money. We were interested in bringing people together and having conversations that we weren't able to have anywhere else and to do it in person. And the spirit of BarCamp and the sort of pay it forward aspect of BarCamp was in the open source tradition. It was like, let's put this thing up, on our GitHub at the time, which was not GitHub. It was code, I don't know, Google Code, maybe, whatever it was, SourceForge, who knows, SVN. And to allow other people to then take and adopt the model and apply it to whatever their own local community and environment was. And I think that's, with Minnebar in particular and other events since then, the idea, and did I make the logo for you?
The original logo, I think I cobbled together from pieces of the stuff. Did you make that, or was Eris the person who did part of that?
So Eris Stassi made the first BarCamp logo. That was, and she did a great job. I think it was Century was the font, and then, did the flame and the Wi-Fi, signal in the flame. And so then subsequently I took that design, and then what was happening was like people would reach out to me and say, hey, can you come organize a BarCamp for us? And I was like, no, Like that's not the point.
Yeah.
The whole idea is that it's open source. And so you can take it and you can fork it. What I will do is I will create a logo for you using your city, town, country's colors. And it then therefore obligates you to pay me back for the logo I made by organizing it yourself. And that actually really worked. So essentially by giving people this gift, it sort of obligated them to carry it forward. And that's been the idea since. So, it's amazing that you're having this event with 1,000 people. I hope, there are a few folks who come and attend and also take from that, the sort of self-direction idea that if they want to have a slightly different event or they want to do an event that's focused on a certain topic, that the mechanics of BarCamp work at a very small level up to a very large level. And then once you get to that scaled level, I think it's reasonable to bring in some level of curation, some level of focus, some level of scaffolding to help people find their way while also supporting some of those breakout sessions that are a little bit more ad hoc, and allowing people to self-organize. I think it's finding that balance that's really like the sweet spot of being a curator of these types of events, such as what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's safe to say that O'Reilly's the Food Camp's biggest impact was to disinvite you and some other people all those years ago, because otherwise we wouldn't have these BarCamps all over the world. I mean, I was looking up some of the stats. There's people coming, 6,500 people in Myanmar on an annual basis. There's got to be over 1 million people that have had a BarCamp experience by now, so super awesome. And yeah, it's just really, really incredible that that's what's happening. So.
Yeah, well, and I think it also sort of helps to tell the story in a more tangible way of the rise and expansion of the internet. The internet was something that there was a relatively small number of people using, back in the early 2000s. And at the time, there was still a lot of skepticism. It was still hard to use. The mobile internet was horrible. It would break all the time. And then to imagine that, 1 million people roughly, let's say, have attended this somewhat obscure, kind of grassroots open source event that came out of Silicon Valley, to me just sort of demonstrates how these technologies have enabled people all over the world to serve their own needs without having to coordinate through a central authority. Like how many of those million people, talk to me or any of the other original BarCamp organizers? Like certainly not that many, and even as we also started talking, I can't even keep track of like how many BarCamps there are now. And that's also the beauty of open source. There are subsequent generations that take those original ideas, those kernels and those nuggets, and they kind of participate in a generative, path that, kind of takes the core or like the genetics of the ideas that we had and carries it into whatever context makes sense for them. And then it scales and it grows. And I don't know, to me, that's sort of a beautiful organic element of what the internet enables, while we're finding ourselves in a moment where, there's a lot of question and doubt about the positive impact of technology on culture and society.
Well, yeah, especially social media and Web3 right now. Although Web3, that term has really been co-opted by the crypto groups and things now. But there's already a Web3. They've been working on it for like a decade.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so that kind of lends itself to the talk about, from these open source values. That also was where the hashtag came from. And, this idea that we want to, promote the well-being of the next generation so that like we all do better and, that sort of thing. So yeah, talk about that a little bit, because I feel like I know a little less about that story.
Sure.
Too.
Yeah. I mean, the way that the sequence, of I don't know, inventions or creations, I guess, in the way that I see the chronology is like, BarCamp it was first the launch of Firefox and really learning about open source and becoming part of that ecosystem and community, being kind of a snot-nosed kid who just showed up in Silicon Valley and, sort of being the only designer in the room and being tasked with designing a 2-page ad for the New York Times. Like I was completely unqualified. I had no idea what I was doing. And yet, because I was there with sort of a spirit of contribution, they just put me, in sort of like the pilot seat. And it's like, figure it out. You know how to, operate an airplane. I don't know. Anyways, so that happened first. And then BarCamp happened. I was like, well, I don't know how to organize a conference. And then sure enough, we self-organize a conference. So I didn't have to organize it. Everyone organized it for me. I just sort of like carried the banner forward. And then a year later, we'd had such a good time with BarCamp and there was so much interest and excitement and we were using the internet to bring ourselves together. Then the question was, well, how do we have BarCamp every day? And that led to co-working. So we started the first co-working spaces in the world in 2006. My friend Brad Newberg, who was kind of an early open web advocate as well, was kind of doing these bi-weekly sessions, bringing people together in the Mission in San Francisco. And it just struck me that this is also the way of the future. People are going to kind of come around, from wherever in the world. They're going to want to work, because they can bring their work with them. They're going to have laptops and mobile technology. We need to create a space for this, like a third space that, anybody can drop into. And so that gave rise to co-working. And just like with BarCamp, we open sourced the model. We, put all our finances out there. We told everyone how it worked, and it, seemed to blossom and take off. And so then in 2007, the hashtag kind of came out of a similar discipline. At the time, given what I'd done with Mozilla and the launch of Firefox, I decided that the browser web as it existed back then was really designed for documents. And to me, the web was really supposed to be about people. So how would you represent people as a basic object within web programming? And the reality was that the formats and technologies didn't exist. So we had platforms like Flickr, and we had Facebook, and we had, Twitter had started in 2006. And it was like, well, how do you really build like web apps and web components that believe that people are first-class citizens within that environment? And that led me to work with a bunch of my friends on a bunch of web standards and technologies like OpenID and OAuth and activity streams. And anyways, there's a whole laundry list of acronyms and stuff that, probably bore you to death. But the goal was to decentralize the social web. The goal was to try to enable people to stand up their own personal websites, their own domains, and to be able to do peer-to-peer connections, from my website to yours. Just like, you have a phone number, I have a phone number. If you're an AT&T customer and I use, Sprint or Verizon or whatever, we can call each other. Why can't the same thing exist for social media and for the social web? And so we set about actually creating a bunch of technologies to enable that. And one of the things that came out of that was the hashtag. It sort of was, I'm not an engineer. I'm not a developer. I am sort of code adjacent. I'm maybe code curious. I can read some code, but I'm not going to write it. You wouldn't want me to write. I can probably write French better than I can write code. Anyways, so nonetheless, I had a lot of friends who were developers, and we were trying to think about how to make Twitter become a more relevant space for conversations. Back in 2006, when Twitter started, it was largely a text-based or SMS-based service. So if I followed you, that meant that I got everything that you tweeted sent to my phone as a text message. Like that's just how it worked. There weren't mobile apps back then. There wasn't the iPhone. So you had to be pretty choosy, with who you followed, because the people were super, loquacious, or actually anyways, if they talked a lot, you didn't want to get all their tweets. And this became a real problem when we went to South by Southwest in March of 2006. So Twitter was, a huge breakout success, but it meant that everybody who had chosen not to go to South by Southwest were getting all their tweets about late night bars and all kinds of stupid stuff that was going on, all the chicanery that happens there in Austin. And so we needed a way to kind of make Twitter more relevant to the people who were there and interested in those topics. And so the way that we had solved that on Flickr was you had groups, just like a forum. You go to like on Reddit, right? Like you sort of go to a subreddit and you post there about the thing that you're interested in. Well, that's fine, but how do you create that type of functionality when you only have 140 characters? So it occurred to me that the way to solve that was to kind of take aspects of IRC, which of course we use for BarCamp, and you had sort of channels, which were prefixed with a pound symbol, and you just use that pound symbol attached to words to identify the topic of the tweet. And so you had 140 characters, but now by adding one or two more other characters, you could set the topic of whatever message you were sending. And then on the server side, you could essentially route those messages to the right audiences. So for example, when I wrote up my blog post, 2,000 words about how I thought this should work, the idea was that I could mute certain tags or I could follow certain tags. It didn't matter if it was, by someone I followed or not. I was interested in the topic. And so that was my proposal. So I wrote it up and, put it out to the world, and not a lot happened for quite a little while. But then slowly I started to talk to the developers and started talking to people who were building apps for Twitter. And they realized like, oh, this actually solves a problem for them. And given the terseness of the medium, this seemed to actually fit pretty well. And so it was actually a lot of the early BarCamps where we were using the hashtag to organize the conversations that were happening. And it's funny because I think back now, and I was kind of a purist about wanting to just use hashtag BarCamp for all the BarCamps, so we could all see what each other was doing as part of this global conversation. But increasingly, of course, each BarCamp wanted to have its own hashtag and then wanted to append the year, and then got more and more specific, which certainly has its function and use. But I think there is an interesting kind of like moment to think back in 2007, where the BarCamp ecosystem was small enough that actually having one sort of hashtag BarCamp for everything was what I thought at the time, a superior way to organize those conversations, as opposed to, of course, getting more specific. But yeah, so anyways, it sort of took a while for the idea to take off. And then once Twitter started to acquire the companies and the developers' apps that had built support for the hashtag, because Twitter hated the hashtag. They didn't want it. They thought it was stupid. They were, they'd been at Google before, the founders. And so they thought they were going to have an algorithm that figured out what tweets were about. And I was like, yeah, you only have 140 characters. How do you have emergent generative stuff that comes out of nowhere, that you never heard before? Like Black Lives Matter. Like, how are you going to index that when that term hasn't even existed? So I was pretty adamant about it. And anyways, it was only once Instagram came around and became popular, and of course, being a visual medium, needed a way to index and tag their content, that Twitter realized, oh my God, we could actually make a lot of money from the hashtag and doing ads. And so that's when they embraced it.
Huh, I didn't realize that. So was there people just throwing hashtags in well before there was any programmatic like linking of it?
Only me. Yeah. And so for quite a while, people were pretty critical because, like, think about it, right? Like, when I was doing this, I mean, what I was doing was insane. Like, I was literally like putting words with a prefix in it, or like squishing together a bunch of words, which were sort of like wiki words, right? Sort of concatenated, words or phrases. But it was a word with like a pound symbol in front of it. And, of course, like, that didn't do anything because they weren't linked to anything. So anyways, yeah, that didn't make a difference. So
yeah. That's funny. Well, I mean, we've talked about a lot of stuff here today. I wondered if you did want to retouch on that Web3 topic a bit, where are we going with all of this? We seem to be going in these waves of centralization, decentralization, centralization again, because we find a problem with being decentralized or being centralized, and then swing all the way to the other side. So where do you think it's going to be, and will we find the happy medium? Or is it going to be like a, anarchist paradise out there where everyone has their own, NFT and currency and everything else?
I love how, like, that phrase to me just sounds like an oxymoron, like an anarchist paradise. That does not sound like a paradise.
No.
I feel like this is just both the curse and the blessing of getting older and kind of like moderating yourself, maybe, because perhaps when I was like 22. I would have been all about kind of, fighting the man and taking the man down. And that's one of the things that drew me to Firefox in the beginning. It was like Microsoft wanted to be, the owner of the internet. And think about how terrible that would have been had, Mozilla not succeeded and not to sort of also become a vehicle for Google's success, and for that balance of powers, essentially. Like, the balance of power thing is real and it's important. But if you don't have that power, or if you're not part of that power, then of course you want some of it either for yourself or for your community, and so on. So I guess one of the terms that I've adopted, which comes from my partner Jo. She does like a lot of amazing work in terms of just empowerment and female empowerment, is pendulation. And so if you think about a pendulum kind of swinging back and forth, that is kind of I don't want to say the fate that we're prescribed to or something, but we are kind of always going in, just like inhalation and exhalation. You go for centralization and then decentralization. There are things that are great about centralization, and then it becomes very kind of cloistered and stuck and conservative. And so you need to sort of oxygenate that and like break it up and move to the other side, and decentralization. But then in decentralization, you have coordination problems. It's very expensive. Everyone has to reinvent the wheel. There's a problem. One of the things that was really hard about creating standards for the social web was that coordination and innovation aspect. It was almost like premature standardization led to ossification. So, for example, RSS was extremely popular for syndicating blog posts and moving that data around, but it didn't model any other verbs except for, created a new post. So as long as the web stuck to blog posts and there were no photos and no likes and, no comments or things like that, it was fine. But that meant that the sort of social web or the publishing web was sort of stillborn in that conception of the internet. And so if you wanted to advance, you needed a format or a protocol or standard that allowed for a greater level of expression and capturing the types of activities that were going on. But that meant that you also then had to upgrade all the clients. Well, if you have a completely decentralized web and you have thousands of clients and they're non-interoperable, now you have chaos. And so essentially you can interop with yourself, but that doesn't lead to very interesting social experiences. So I guess to sort of try to provide a lens on an answer to your question, one, it is sort of an Occam's razor type of thing where you need to have simpler, clearer, kind of well-scoped solutions for a very specific set of problems, and to be very aware of your intention and what types of behaviors you're designing for and to solve for versus those which you are not. And one of the problems that I think I've seen over time is there's a desire to either kind of boil the ocean and over specify and capture everything, which makes something that's very brittle and doesn't age well, or there's something that is so sort of bespoke and narrow that they're trying to solve for, let's say, a certain type of governance, while only thinking about their own kind of community and how their community behaves, and then missing something altogether that's like an externality or a type of attack vector. And so you're seeing that now with a lot of Web3 tokens and platforms that within their own sphere of influence makes sense, but then when you actually try to solve real problems for real people in the real world, suddenly their solutions break down. They're either too technical, or they make assumptions about how sophisticated or how willing people are to jump through hoops to get the benefits of these things. So I mean, on the one hand, like I love where we are in the Web3 kind of crypto space, because at least we're starting to see people really take risks and experiment again. I think the thing that is most concerning to me about Web3 are the incentives, and what adding in economic incentives do in a culture and society that doesn't quite know how to talk to itself or the people about money and about privilege and about access. And
really,
so I don't
anything if you look at Twitter.
Well, as I've heard people say, Twitter is not the real world, but it's true. Twitter does represent sort of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation of social media. But anyways, I mean, to your question, I think the only thing that I've learned is you really have to become very good at being curious and listening, and being very clear about who you want to enfranchise and who sort of is bearing the costs of that enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. I think I've learned a lot more respect for Tim O'Reilly and what he was doing with Food Camp, and having sort of a small group of people where not everyone was invited, and was very specific about the types of people that were brought in. I think over time, as you run open events or open models, you can have people that are simply there to promote their own agenda or to take from the community as opposed to contribute. And that requires a lot of gardening and being very careful about the types of culture that are brought in. And so it takes leadership to then ask people to show up in a different way than they might have come, so that they actually benefit longer term from an overall ecosystem that grows. But that takes so much time and so much energy and effort. And so I think, I guess, if I were to leave, the audience with anything, it's to I guess to appreciate, Ben, like, what you've been doing and how you have been curating and cultivating and enriching this community for, the last 10, 15 years, and playing that role. Because without folks like you who are, relatively, I think, like selfless, obviously you benefit from the community, but it's, of course, you also put the community first. These things are also part of that pendulation of moving forward towards centralization while also being mindful of decentralization and bringing more people in, as you've done. So even though maybe last year or 2 years ago, 1,500 people, now it's like 1,000. Well, you have to be very careful and to protect people from, maybe you'll do a medium-sized super spreader event instead of a massive one,
Yeah.
But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think as to the degree that you're providing that model, I hope other people are seeing that and are recognizing kind of like that it does take time to do these things well and right, and that Web3 is not going to provide any fast answers. I hope that it helps people to experiment and to try and to explore and to think about governance, but to also think about how lots of people before them also tried a bunch of things, and that those things actually work and are worth learning from, if not kind of adapting those ideas to the current moment in ways that take into consideration technology and what it enables, but also what it brings on us as well.
Yeah, well, that's well said. And I really want to thank you for your time today, Chris. It's been really great. I'd also like to thank the current organizers of Minnebar. You know, so many things go into this. There's like a team of dozens that help out, not to mention all the volunteers that are day of people. So I've stepped back from day-to-day operations for the last 6 or so years, but I'm very happy to be a part of this one 16 years after it, and to have this conversation with you, Chris. So thank you again.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, and I hope everyone has a great time.
All right, thank you.